Welcome to the Graphic Medicine Podcast. We are the one and only podcast dedicated to discussing comics as they intersect with issues of health, illness, disability, and caregiving. And today's is a really special episode because we're going to bring you a conversation between myself, MK Serwick, with Alex Thomas and Michael Green. Michael and Alex are both doctors and members of the board of the Graphic Medicine International Collective. And they developed the Frontline Comics project and stories, which are stories from the COVID pandemic that are collaborations between frontline workers and comic artists. Welcome to the podcast, Michael and Alex.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us
here.
Well, rather than me kind of summarizing your introductions and what you do and who you are, would you like to introduce yourselves? Alex, would you go first?
Sure. So I'm Alex Thomas. So I'm a board member on the Graphic Medicine International Collective. I'm also a physician and a cartoonist. So I'm in clinical practice in allergy and immunology. And I'm also part of a company called Booster Shot Media, where we create educational materials for patients of all ages on every side of the healthcare equation, using comics and videos to help kind of make that educational process more streamlined, efficient, and equitable for everybody.
Great. And Michael?
Great. Michael Green. I am also a board member. I'm currently the co-president of the organization. And like Alex, I'm a physician. I work with adults. He works with kids. I'm a general internal medicine doctor. I'm an academic physician. So I work at Penn State College of Medicine, and I sort of do all the things that academic physicians do. I see patients, I do research, and I do a lot of teaching and also administrative work. And I also make art as part of my professional and personal identity. And I've been teaching a course on comics and medicine for a dozen years or so to fourth year med students, where we both read graphic medicine kinds of texts, and I help students create comics about their own experiences as medical students, and help them sort of reflect on their journey from being students to becoming doctors. And so I've been at this for this graphic medicine thing since the beginning.
Absolutely. There's so much in each of those introductions that I feel like we could spend a whole episode just talking about how you integrate all those things. And I'm like dying to ask all these questions, but we're here and we're going to focus on the Frontline Comics project. So I want to ask you first, and we'll start with Alex. Can you give us a bit of a history of this project that we're featuring in this episode?
Sure. Yeah. So the project really was born out of kind of a need that we felt early on in the pandemic. So if we all can kind of look back 3 years, at the start of the pandemic, things were really kind of chaotic and uncertain. And especially for frontline workers, there was not a lot of guidance or support for folks that were, not able to work from home and having to either work in healthcare or other frontline positions. And so early on in the pandemic, one thing I was noticing, and as a healthcare provider myself, I also felt no support in terms of how to continue to function as a physician during a pandemic when there was not enough masks or tests or guidance on what to do with patients who were positive. And what I was realizing early on is that in the absence of guidance from anywhere official, groups were kind of spontaneously being formed, like from my experience, it was on Facebook, where frontline workers were kind of just starting these groups to kind of share tips about how to obtain masks when they're unavailable, how to best, ration hand sanitizer. And then, it turned from those practical concerns to more kind of avenues for catharsis, where people were just sharing their, experiences that they had never experienced before in terms of, the stresses of working and functioning on the front lines and managing that with having family at home, loved ones who may be ill. And as I was kind of looking at this, I was realizing that there could be a way that as graphic medicine, as a group, that we could maybe contribute. And so one of the things that we began talking about early on in our meetings in 2020 was there a way that we could contribute, using comics to help kind of support people working on the front lines? And so one of the thoughts that we came up with early on was, can we find a way to take these kind of avenues of catharsis that people were kind of spontaneously doing on private Facebook groups and create artwork out of it? Could we, connect frontline workers with cartoonists to take some of these unique stories and perspectives and create work that could be both, serving as a historical document of this unprecedented time we lived through, but also as a means for catharsis? Because I think a lot of times people were telling stories who were not, never thought of themselves as writers or storytellers. And so I thought, early on that this could be a way to do that. Now, that's where kind of the initial ideas kind of ended with me. And then I brought it to the group and said, okay, what can we do? How can we do this? And that's where Michael kind of came in and really helped add structure to kind of some of these initial, thoughts.
Michael, do you want to pick up there?
Sure. Well, I mean, when Alex introduced this idea, it just immediately resonated with me because, I've spent so much of my time working with young healthcare providers, helping them sort of tell stories about their experience. And I had a really, we all have our own experiences with the pandemic, and I had a really kind of dual kind of experience. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I was highly engaged with trying to think through these worst case scenarios. I was running the COVID ethics task force for the whole College of Medicine, for the, all of the Penn State Hershey medical system. And we were dealing with some really dark scenarios, like what do we do if, we don't have enough ventilators and we have to decide who gets the ventilator and who lives and who doesn't live, and what do we do if we have to ration the resources? And, we were making policies and establishing working groups. And I was, sort of working my butt off on sort of trying to prepare for this great unknown. And so really, immersed with that. And then after, I can't remember the sequence because everything's a blur during the past, but I went on sabbatical, a long anticipated sabbatical leave, which, I was like, well, am I going to take sabbatical now that we're in COVID? Am I going to not take sabbatical? I said, I'm going to do it. I mean, I had really planned for it. So I went from really being immersed in this world to like, I'm on my porch, this porch right here that you see, without clinical responsibilities and without any of my normal day-to-day responsibilities. And it was really like, a shock to the system because my colleagues were on the front lines and I'm still hearing about it. And I'm like, I'm safely, away from it. And so I was really thinking a lot about, what do I do with this time and how do I process this reality of this crazy pandemic that we're all going through? And so the idea of taking these stories and telling them visually was something that just seemed like a fantastic idea and something that I could help with. And so I got, very much involved with it. And I'm often kind of a logistics type of person. So I was thinking, all right, well, how can we organize this, and how do we get the funding, and what are, and who are the players, and who do we have to get involved? And, and so then we started preparing and planning for something that could be a little bit bigger than just, a few people that we knew or connected to, but like, maybe establish a larger network of storytellers and artists and connect them together.
So I'm going to stop you there. Tell me then how exactly that process evolved. So how did you find the storytellers? How did you find the cartoonists? And then I know there was a third person that was involved there. How did you pair those triads up? Alex, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, so one thing that that I did early on was I kind of just I tried to do like a pilot comic just to kind of test the idea. So we had an ER physician who was a friend of my brother's, and then JD Lent, who we know kind of just through the graphic medicine community, work as kind of a writer and then the storyteller, and then I was kind of like going to be the cartoonist for this comic. And as we kind of worked on this pilot, I realized that that there was a need for like a third person, like a between the writer and the artist, and what we eventually called a facilitator. And what that person was basically someone who could kind of bridge the gap between the communication between a storyteller and the artist. At times, during the pilot, I realized the storyteller would sometimes kind of slip into medical jargon in their storytelling. And so it was useful for me to be like, okay, wait, JD, do you understand what that means? That kind of thing. Where otherwise it would kind of, because there were kind of really significant points of the story that were kind of lost in jargon that was helpful to kind of tease apart. And then at the same time, it's kind of like, you don't expect like an artist to necessarily be like, a professional communicator to be able to kind of like interpret a storyteller who maybe has never written a story before to translate that into a comic. So I think it was useful to have kind of like a third party to kind of facilitate the collaboration. That's kind of how that idea kind of came from. So then we looked, within our board and other people who've kind of worked in that area to see if anyone is interested in facilitating, and there was a lot of people that volunteered. So then the next step was to see if we could find artists who were interested. and one thing, as Michael mentioned, was that funding was an important component. So one thing that we wanted to do for sure was to be able to pay the artist as well as storyteller for their time. I mean, this is like in the middle of the pandemic, and we're having them spend hours to create this work that we wanted to make sure, that they were being compensated for that. So that part of, the efforts that Michael really made happen was to be able to kind of organize and secure funding so that we could be able to pay everyone for their work and time on this project. So then, yeah, once we put out a call for submissions for artists, like I could not believe the amount of response we got. Within like a week, I think we'd gotten like 60 people, and then a month after that, like 100 people. It was just like it went, and these are all like really amazing artists and cartoonists. We were, we had so many amazing people that just were eager to contribute, and a lot of people it was because they were also kind of at home and feeling kind of helpless and wanted to do something to kind of try to help. And so, yeah, once we had that huge response from artists, we realized that this was going to be something that we could really make a kind of robust, amazing project.
Yeah, if I could just add to that a little bit, we put out the call for artists, we put out a similar call for storytellers, and we got a nice response from a diverse group of storytellers as well. I mean, the frontline workers, we define fairly broadly. I mean, there's the doctors, but there's also nurses and social workers, and there's people who clean the rooms, and there's and then I don't think we have any of these yet, but when you think about frontline workers, there's the people who were working at the grocery store, which was open, where and they were providing groceries, and so we were trying to think of frontline workers in a very broad term, and we got a diverse set of stories, mostly from healthcare providers, and then. Just to pick up on the story, the matchmaking process was something that was an interesting challenge. We looked at all the stories, and we read them very carefully, and we reviewed all of the artists. We asked to send samples of their work or portfolios or whatever, and we tried to identify styles that we thought would match the story. And so you don't want, somebody's telling a very dark and foreboding story about something terrible. You don't want, zebras and unicorns and rainbow, and smiler. It has to be a fit. And so, but we tried to match that up, but we didn't make the final decision. We sort of worked with these third-party facilitators and said, all right, here's a couple of artists. There's 2 or 3 artists that we think could work. Why don't you guys, the facility? I can't remember how we did it actually, but we had them work together to try to figure out what the best match was. Maybe Alex remembers the specifics of how we decided.
Yeah, I think I know it's been a while since we went through this. So I think that the facilitators, I think for the most part, made the decisions about connecting the two because I think that they had access to all of the artists and all of their sample work, and then had access to all the stories. So I think that if I recall correctly, I think what happened was that the facilitators picked a story that they felt like would make a good comic, and then from there went through the list of artists to find an artist that would make that would be a good match. I think that's kind of how it was. But I feel like
That's
for the
right. I
most
think
part,
that's right.
the facilitators did the majority of that kind of decision making. I think that our part of it was really just organizing the two groups of folks so that there was kind of a comprehensive list of on either side with succinct information that that the facilitators could kind of glean without being overwhelmed with the information.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And how long was the process where people were actually kind of out there working? Like once they'd matched that up and they'd kind of, I assume they sort of met amongst themselves. How long of a process was it where they were just kind of working on this and reworking? And how long did that process last?
Yeah, I mean we kept it generally open ended. I think the main thing is we put some limits on like the size of the comic. One to like kind of keep the story into a kind of digestible amount, as well as to kind of keep the work itself kind of more or less kind of the similar amount of work because the pay was kind of the same for each project. So we want to make sure that the same roughly amount of work was being done by everyone. So I think the parameters we had was a 4 to 8 page color comic was the end product. And so with that, we had kind of very loose kind of guidelines of Zoom calls with the facilitators, the artist, and the storyteller to kind of work on the comic. So for everyone, I think it was roughly I don't know, maybe like a 4 to 6 month process from start to like complete finish of it, and it really depended on the timing of everyone. So for a lot of folks, the storytellers were like busy healthcare workers in the middle of the pandemic. So part of it was like trying to coordinate time where they were able to kind of write, revise, meet, things like that. But I think it was roughly that type of time frame.
Cool, cool. So as it stands now, there's a website, which of course we'll link to and share. And there are 7 comics on it that were completed as part of this sort of first phase of the project. Is there one particular comic that each of you would like to discuss, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased. Like, I would love to talk about the comic that I facilitated, just because I am most aware of the process in terms of creating it. So I'd love to talk about that.
Great.
And I will say that everyone should visit the website and read these comics completely. They're all very unique and all incredibly powerful. Alrighty, so this comic is called Coming Home. And it is a story by a pediatric emergency room physician named Sabrina Akhter. And it was illustrated by Zara Slattery, who is an amazing cartoonist, most recently creating an award-winning graphic novel called Coma, printed by Myriad Editions in 2021. So this comic was about Sabrine's experiences early on in the pandemic when she was coming home from these long shifts in the ER where there was, so many people with COVID coming in, where there was, unclear guidance on how to protect yourself, how to protect others. And also there's a lot of like not clear information about how COVID could be transmitted. And so this comic specifically is about the anxiety she felt when coming home from working this ER shift and entering her home with her 2 young children and her husband. And so in this comic, she goes through the process of basically on a cold Seattle morning, undressing outside the apartment or outside the home, worrying that anything that was on her body in the ER could contain COVID that could transmit to her family. So the comic itself kind of goes through her internal thought process as she does this and the worries she's feeling, as well as kind of how she doesn't know if this is the right thing to do, but feels like this is, the only thing she can do at this point. She's freezing cold and texting her husband saying, "Okay, I'm coming in. Make sure the kids are away when I enter the the home, because typically, when mom comes home, the kids go and run and give her a hug, and she doesn't want that to happen until she takes a shower. So she waits for her husband to text back in the cold, and then once she gets the okay, she kind of runs in and runs into the shower before anyone can see her. And then once she's in the shower is when she finally kind of starts to decompress from the trauma of the day. And that's kind of where you hear her thoughts and kind of see, her fears and anxieties kind of wash over her as she tries to feel comfortable to finally see her family again. So it was an amazing comic, and the process of making it was really great. The way that we worked on it was Sabrine had written a version of this in prose. And so what Zara did was she kind of took that and broke it down into thumbnails and breakdowns that would kind of limit it to that page limit parameter that we put it on. And then it was just a matter of kind of editing. And this was one of those things where it did help to have a third-party facilitator, because I think that not just with this comic, but I know with others, the artists sometimes felt like they weren't able to like cut out parts of dialogue from the storyteller's story, because it was their story. But to make a comic, you really do need to have some economy of words, and that's part of what the images do so much work without needing the words. So part of it was trying to like trim down parts of the prose section that were not necessary now that we have images to kind of support things. So a lot of it was kind of making those kind of adjustments, and then trying to see how they best match with the images that she was creating. And honestly, a lot of it had to do with like Sabrine giving Zara like photo references of her home and her front step, and exactly like how she was doing this and where her shoes were going in this box outside the house. And so it was it was very specific, and I think that that's what made this story so powerful, is that it was incredibly specific for her experience. And looking at it now in retrospect, it seems like this crazy thing to have done, to be undressing in your front stoop. But in the spring of 2020, no one had any idea what was going on, and this was like so many physicians and healthcare workers and people working in the ER were doing this just to kind of try to stay safe. So yeah, that was this comic, and I'm really proud of the work that they both put into it, and it's on the website if anyone wants to take a closer look at it.
And it's really beautiful, really beautiful. Just such painterly illustrations, and yeah, it's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Alex. Michael?
So the story that I facilitated was written by Jessica Erickson at the bottom here and illustrated by Maria Vermazes, and it's called Negotiating the Family Gathering. And this was a really interesting story, because the storyteller was a pediatric infectious disease doctor. And so she was right in the thick of things in terms of dealing with with COVID. She was an infectious disease person. But she had, the other part of the story is that she also developed cancer and was a cancer patient during this time, and was feeling both the expertise of her knowledge and the incredible vulnerability of being a patient herself and being immunocompromised and very susceptible to illness. And so the story was about her. This is toward the beginning of the pandemic, when people weren't gathering in family events very often, and her mother was inviting her for a event, to come. Everyone's asking, are you coming over for dinner, a big family gathering? She's like, I can't come. Your family, we don't worry about that stuff, right? And so she's like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. And then she was trying to explain to her mother why she couldn't come to this family gathering. She had sort of recovered from her cancer at this point, but then she sort of tells the story about why she feels so strongly about it. And there's these images of how she's bringing her patients with her in this backpack, and they didn't sign up for this. And so she explains, well, what did that mean? And she's like, well, remember when I had cancer and how challenging it was and so on. And then she tells the story about when she was getting this MRI scan, and here she is being transformed back into this cancer patient. And the MRI tech was just sort of casually talking to her and saying, here, you try these headphones in the MRI scanner. It's very noisy. I wear them on my other job that I work as a barista because it's really loud there. And then Jessica just sort of freaks out. She's like, what? She's working a second job, and she's like, I'm being super careful and I'm trusting these people. And now she's, working at Starbucks or whatever, and the public is interacting. She's like, I didn't agree to that. I'll be exposed to you, but I don't want to be exposed to all these other people. And then so she talks about kind of this domino effect. And so she used that to explain to her mother, who really didn't quite understand it, but they ultimately agreed that they'll, continue to, love each other and see each other when they can, and and look forward to safer times in the future. And so that was the story, and it was I think beautifully rendered by the artist with these watercolor washes, and she really captured a lot of the feeling behind the story. And like the story that Alex was describing, this too started out in prose. It began as an article that was submitted to an academic medical journal, but it didn't get accepted. Actually, they're like, oh, this isn't what we're looking for, or whatever. And she tried a couple of places, and it did, when she told the story, and Jessica's somebody that I know. I work with her, and I said, this would be a fantastic visual story. I mean, I think if we told the story not just with words, but showed what you were going through using this medium of comics, I think it would really resonate with folks. And so then when it got transformed into this comic, I think it took on a new life. And I was just really pleased with how beautiful it came out. And I think she was too.
Yeah, it's just amazing seeing both of these comics because it takes us back. It takes it right back to those moments and each of those stories are these particular moments that you could easily forget, that we all can in one way or another resonate with, right? And as we sort of, think about a time where we're, in a different mind frame about COVID, that time when we didn't know how it was transmitted, the time when we couldn't explain to our loved ones who were lonely why we couldn't be there, right? And that, oh, it's just us, we're just family, like how that didn't work, and all of these things that I think could easily get lost if we hadn't created these beautiful kind of memorials to the people and their sacrifices, but also just those moments. They're both sort of like tender moments of connection and trying to do the best we could, and then the stress and all of that. But it's just really, those comics just take us right back. Yeah.
Yeah. And MK, I just want to pick up on that. I mean, one of the motivations that we had for doing this was to contribute to the historical record, because we all know memories are fallible, and and we do forget, and especially unpleasant things. We don't want to remember all the unpleasantness around it, and so it's we want to we're a move on culture. Let's just put this behind us. But it's really important to remember what we all went through and what the experience was like at the time, not just looking back on it 3 years later. And I think putting these things and committing them to paper, so to speak, I think really helps to create the historical record. Interestingly, when I for a different project, I was sort of looking for evidence of the historical record of the 1918 flu pandemic. And there's surprisingly, I mean, there's stuff out there, but there's not a lot of personal stories and memoirs, certainly not comics of that. And that was a world-changing event, and there's not as much information about what people's personal experiences was like. And we wanted to do something to help remedy that for future generations about the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, we all knew that we were living through kind of historic times when it was happening. It's one of those odd things where, like, it wasn't in retrospect. We were like, all of us were kind of like, we are going to remember this as a historical time. So I think when we started the project, we had that in mind, but as these were comics were being created, they very much were in the present tense, you know, means of catharsis, means of having, folks process their experiences. But now when we look back on these comics, because now it's been, about a year since these were completed, and, probably 2 years since they were first starting to be, formulated in the storytellers' minds. It's really interesting because it's true, Michael. Like, looking at it now, these do function as historical documents. Now that we're kind of this far out of, like, the worst of it, it's just very strange now looking at it through that lens, because it does function in that way where, like you said, MK, takes you right back to those times that we kind of tend to forget about as we kind of live on our lives.
Yeah, and just picking up on that thread, like, what kind of feedback have you gotten on the comics, and from the people who participated, and then just sort of others who may have found resonance with them?
I mean, I think that, from the storytellers, we got a lot of positive feedback that it was kind of a good experience for the majority of them to create the comics themselves. I think for a lot of folks, it did function as kind of a way to process their experiences. And for many of our storytellers, they've never participated in creating a comic before. So I think that collaboration, I think, also was really meaningful to them. And then on the other side of it, I do feel like many of the artists who participated similarly didn't, some of them hadn't collaborated in a storytelling type of, project like this, especially, about COVID. So I think that for a lot of folks, it was a positive experience to be able to, on the artist side, kind of help contribute, to something positive from the pandemic. And then on the storyteller side, a way to kind of create something, beautiful from a potentially traumatic experience.
Michael, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Oh, I agree. I mean, Alex said it quite well.
So we're just gonna, this has just been such a wonderful conversation. I want to just kind of take it to the next steps. What do you see moving forward with this project? You talked about having, like, so many people who wanted to tell stories and cartoonists who wanted to be involved. What's the next step?
Well, so this was phase one, and we're now pleased to say that we're beginning phase two. We were waiting to finish these and have, a critical mass of comics and develop the website and so on. And then we had to secure some additional funding in order to move on to the next phase. But we're there now, and so we're going to do another. We just issued another call for stories and calls for artists, and we're going to go through the matchmaking process again with facilitators, and we're going to keep going with the project, and we're going to, hopefully diversify the kinds of stories that are being told, and the variety of people who are telling the stories and making the art, and we're going to keep growing this. We hope that this project is going to evolve beyond the pandemic. Right now, we're still quite involved in frontline pandemic stories, but we do have the infrastructure now, and we have a methodology in place where we can match storytellers and artists, which is, I think, a fantastic opportunity to keep telling stories even after the COVID pandemic is behind us. But we are right now going to do phase two of the COVID stories, and then keep it going in one way or another after that.
Well, I was just going to say, graphic medicine, what's amazing about, this group is that we, and by group, I mean all the people in the graphic medicine community, is that we tend to kind of navigate these spaces between healthcare and comics, and it seems like we are in a good position to be able to connect, people together to make new comics. And so I think that's the most exciting thing about this, is that we're able to kind of facilitate, in a more general term, the creation of these interesting comics that may not have been made otherwise, from people who may not have been motivated to make a comic, before, because they or a healthcare worker that never thought to make a comic. And so I think that part of it is very exciting. So yeah, the phase 2 is starting. So I think the calls for submissions should be out by the time this hits the airways. And also, yeah, go to the website as well, and that's where you can find information. I think, as Michael said, we're looking to hear stories not just of kind of 2020 experiences, but now everything since then, because I think there's so many new perspectives, and with the different thoughts and reactions people have had to the pandemic and kind of changes in our protections or lack thereof. I mean, there's a lot of perspectives that are worth fleshing out and sharing. And so I think that's where we're looking forward to hearing from.
That sounds wonderful, and absolutely we'll include all the contact information. If anyone watching or listening is interested in being involved, we'll make sure that all the information you need is available with this episode. So I can't thank either of you enough. Thank you so much for being guests and talking about this amazing project.
Thanks for having us. This is great.
It's been great.